I'd like to share this analogy with you because I find it really useful in understanding where you're coming from on a day-to-day basis. Are you showing up more in your survival patterns? Are you stuck in one of your trauma responses? Or are you showing up as you in your truth? Now, this is real valuable information to pay attention to because the more we can recognize that we're showing up in one of our survival patterns or we're stuck in one of our trauma responses, the more we can be curious and start to explore how to support ourselves to move out of whatever we're stuck in, or to shift out of those patterns that once definitely served you, but chances are they are no longer needed. Now, this analogy I'd like to share stems from the work of Peter Levine, the founder of somatic experiencing, and I'd like to share my interpretation of this analogy. Now, think of a river. When you think of a river, what do you think of? Water in motion, right? Water moving down the river. That water is in flow. There may be obstacles in the way, but that water can always make its way past the obstacles. Now, us humans also have access to that flow state. We are designed to organically adapt, adjust to whatever changes are happening in our environment. Given the situation, we adapt, we adjust, there's an obstacle, great, okay, and then we move through. Emotions are a great example of this. Emotions ultimately are energy in motion, right? Something arises, we experience something, and then we move through it, ideally. How great would it be if us human beings were showing up in that flow state more often? This world would be a very different place. But instead, we get pulled into our trauma that we're stuck in, or we get pulled into our survival patterns. And these are more like vortexes, still connected to the river, important to recognize, yet we get pulled into these vortexes of being instead of being in the flow. So when we show up from these survival patterns or we're stuck in a trauma response, this has a very different quality, a way of being, than when we are in flow. And that's what I would encourage you to do, is start to investigate, what does it feel like, look like, what's your experience when you're in flow versus when you're in a survival pattern or when you're stuck in a trauma response. Because often when we're in these vortexes, because we all have them, we're all going to get stuck in them, our experience is going to be very different. It has a different quality to it. When we're in flow, it's easier to be more present, to be engaged, to be connected to ourselves, to our environment, to other people. There's this sense of presence that's very valuable and important. And when you learn to recognize that, that's juicy, right? This is a good place to be. Versus these vortexes tend to be more chaotic. We might be more overwhelmed, disconnected, unable to engage, right? We're showing up more in this survival energy. So get curious on what that looks like to you. What does that feel like to you? And how can you start to recognize when you're in flow versus when you're in one of the vortexes? Now, important to recognize, these vortexes, you might live your life from those places, and that's totally fine. There's still a river, you just haven't accessed it yet, or it's unfamiliar territory. And actually being present and being in flow might feel really scary because it's unknown territory. That which is unfamiliar is often scary. So recognize that. Valuable information. You live your life from the vortexes. You're definitely not alone in that. But again, start to get curious. What's the quality of the vortex like? And what's this quality of the river like? And when do you experience it? And it might even just be for a millisecond, but that's still a moment for your system to recognize, like, oh, something else is possible here. Because the more we start to connect into the river, the more we gain access to our wholeness, the more we gain access to our essence, our truth, whatever word ultimately you want to stick in there, the more we can support ourselves to heal these trauma responses, the more we can shift out of these survival patterns. And these vortexes will become less intense, they'll suck you in less often, and you'll be able to drive the bus from the river instead of living your life from these vortexes. The less we live our life from the vortexes, the less intense they are, the more water ends up in our river. the more we have access to flow, the more we have access to wholeness, to our truth, to recognizing who we really are. So, hopefully this video entices you a little to start to investigate, to get curious. What does it mean? What does it feel like? What does it look like to you when you're in one of the vortexes? And maybe that's familiar territory. Recognize that. What does it look like when you're in flow? What does that feel like? What does that look like to you? What's your experience there? And how can you start to do this dance in between these two experiences? Because it's that dance that will help shift you out of your trauma. That'll help you shift out of those survival patterns and allow you to gain more access to your truth. So, if you're curious on more on this, I have a free webinar where I discuss this in a little more detail, and I've got some programs where I support people in moving out of these vortexes and into more flow. So feel free to inquire, feel free to ask questions, feel free to share, comment, all those fun things. The more conversations we can have around this, the better. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Nicole, and I look forward to supporting you in moving out of survival and into more flow. Let's do this.